Welcome to Hope Family Resources, where counseling resources bring hope to the heart of your family. The problem of sexual addiction is one of the most frightening realities of contemporary society. In today's program, Dr. Denise Mari and Tom Lamar discuss the different signs of sexual addiction and their root causes, and offer some helpful remedies and tools for escaping sexual slavery.
Dr. Mari, what exactly does it mean to have a sexual addiction?
When increasingly inappropriate sexual feelings, thoughts, and behaviors are necessary for sexual pleasure, it's actually a state of sexual intoxication, you might say. It's really counterfeit sexual love.
How widespread is the problem of sexual addiction?
Unfortunately, it has reached epidemic proportions today, so that it's not only tearing individuals apart, but it's also destroying families and also hurting many innocent people.
What are some of the signs of sexual addiction?
Well, sexual addiction can be noticed in, for example, the person who becomes increasingly dishonest about his whereabouts, someone who's beginning to hide magazines, perhaps in a drawer under a table, a person who's becoming increasingly depressed with no apparent reason, a lot of subtle kind of signs.
What would be some of the characteristics of addiction?
Well, actually, there are 5 major characteristics of addiction. Dr. Gerald May says that the first is withdrawal, then there's tolerance, also self-deception, as well as loss of willpower and even a distortion of attention.
Can you explain what you mean by tolerance?
Okay, tolerance actually refers to the fact that a person who is an addict finds it necessary to actually view increasingly explicit sexual material to the point that what used to arouse him and stimulate him actually no longer works. Now, withdrawal is actually a problem that is characteristic of addiction, in that you find that a person who, let's say, is a sex addict and has been without some kind of a sexual experience for a while, finds that he starts to get a little out of sorts, starts feeling grouchy perhaps, or irritable, and finds that the only way to restore the sense of normalcy will actually be to act out sexually.
What about the addict's tendency to self-deception?
Well, self-deception is a very big problem in addiction. You'll often find that a sex addict actually engages in a lot of what would be called rationalization behaviors. He rationalizes different things that are going on in his life, distorts reality, actually really is lying to himself about his problem. For example, you might find that if he's questioned about a particular use of pornography, for example, he might then try to say, well, I'm not really addicted to that, but actually I can easily switch to another form of perhaps less explicit pornography, but he's really just fooling himself and trying to look good in front of other people.
Dr. Mari, what about the 4th characteristic of sexual addiction, the loss of willpower?
The loss of willpower is, at some level, even more frightening problem of sexual addiction, in that the person who has really gotten full swing into this type of enslavement actually begins to have difficulty refraining from the slightest type of sexually arousing material. So, for example, you might have a teenager who finds that if his mother is away from work, he just cannot keep a resolution to not steal her lingerie catalog, and instead will find that no matter how much he tells himself that he has to stop doing it, he nonetheless succumbs to his temptation.
And what do you mean by the last characteristic of addiction, distortion of attention?
Okay, distortion of attention is a problem really of mental attention, in that the addict has so much concentration and focus on sexually explicit material that it begins to actually almost crowd his mind, you might say, to the point that he has trouble concentrating on things in daily life, so that he actually finds that the only way he can return to what he considers to be a normal state is to actually engage in whatever's on his mind. So, for example, he might have a fixation on visiting a certain prostitute, and he finds that the only way to relieve the problem is actually to go ahead and act on it, just to actually drain his brain, you might say, of all the thoughts that are crowding it.
Mm. From what you're saying, it sounds as if there's different levels of addiction. Is this true?
Yes, actually, an addict doesn't stay at one level of addiction. He actually progresses further and further and more slowly to higher levels. So for example, you have an addict who might be said to be at level 1 of addiction. He may be involved in viewing pornography, fantasizing all the time, and you'll find that he then cannot help but move on to the next stage, which is actually involving people in a live way in his behavior. So for example, you might say that he will try to then get involved in things like telephone sex, perhaps get involved with actual people as opposed to just viewing the material. But then from there, he can move on to level 3, in which he actually perhaps goes out to hire prostitutes or maybe even exposes himself publicly. The worst level is the last one, which would actually include behaviors such as rape or incest. So even child molestation is a possibility at level 4. So this is really the degrading level that a sex addict can sink to.